It was a day like any other. But for Thomas, this would be the day that everything changed. He didn't know it at the time, but it was as if fate had set something in motion that day, something irreversible. Thomas was a man of routine, someone who had his life in order and felt comfortable in the predictability of his days. Every morning, he woke up at 6, made coffee while skimming through the newspaper, and then headed off to his job as a financial advisor at a large firm in the city. His life was stable, perhaps too stable. He had a beautiful wife, Anne-Marie, and together they had 2 children, Sophie and Don. His marriage was, by and large, happy, or so it seemed. They lived in a spacious single-family home in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where neighbors greet each other good morning and the sounds of barking dogs and playing children fill the streets. To the outside world, everything seemed perfect. But something gnawed at Thomas, something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the monotony that had crept in, or the lack of excitement that made him restless. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he had yet to acknowledge. It was on a weekday, during his lunch break, that it all began. Thomas had decided to get his usual sandwich at the local deli. It was a small, cozy shop where he had been going for years, and where the owner, a friendly older lady, always greeted him with a warm smile. As he stood in line, his eyes fell on a woman sitting at a table by the window. She was busy working on her laptop and seemed completely absorbed in her own world. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her face had a natural elegance that immediately caught Thomas's attention. He had no idea why, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about her that intrigued him, something mysterious, as if she carried a secret that he wanted to unravel. When she briefly looked up from her screen and their eyes met, he felt an undeniable spark. It wasn't a big, all-consuming fire, but a subtle, almost imperceptible tingling that ran through his body. She smiled at him. A friendly smile that could have been meant for anyone. But at that moment, it felt as though it was meant only for him. Thomas noticed his heartbeat quicken, and he suddenly felt nervous, something he hadn't felt in years. He mentally chastised himself. "Don't be ridiculous, Thomas. You're happily married." But that thought couldn't stop him from thinking about her, even after he had picked up his sandwich and returned to work. Her image lingered in his mind, like a fleeting dream just beyond his reach. In the days that followed, he tried to push her out of his head, but he couldn't. Every time he walked into the deli, he found himself unconsciously looking at the same table by the window, hoping to see her there again. But she wasn't there, and slowly he began to wonder if he had just imagined her. Until one day, a week later, he saw her again. This time, she was sitting at the bar, her fingers typing rapidly on her laptop's keys. Without thinking, Thomas walked up to her, and before he realized it, he heard himself say, "May I sit here?" She looked up, surprised, but not unpleasantly so. "Of course," she replied, moving her belongings slightly to make room for him. "I'm Laura, by the way." "Thomas?" He introduced himself as he sat down next to her. He felt a slight tension in the air, as if something important was about to happen, something that would turn his life upside down. But he ignored it and started a conversation with her, initially a bit awkward, but soon they discovered they had a lot in common. They talked about their jobs, the city, and life in general. It felt easy, natural, as if they had known each other for years. That lunch turned into a long afternoon, during which they kept talking, laughing, and getting to know each other better. When he finally returned to work, it was with a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. But at the same time, there was a sense of guilt he couldn't ignore. He hadn't done anything wrong, he told himself. It was just an innocent encounter. Yet it felt as though he had crossed a line he had never expected to have to guard. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Laura sought each other's company more and more often. What began as chance meetings during lunch breaks soon turned into planned appointments. They met for coffee, for walks in the park, and eventually for dinner. Every moment he spent with her felt like an escape from his daily life, an escape from the monotony that had held him in its grip for so long. At first, he reassured himself with the thought that it meant nothing, that it was just a friendship, But deep down, he knew better. Every time he looked at her, he felt a longing he could no longer deny. He was falling in love with her, and although he tried to hold back, that feeling grew stronger by the day. At home, Anne-Marie began to notice that something was changing. Thomas was distant. His thoughts were elsewhere. He came home later from work, gave vague answers to her questions, and seemed to withdraw more and more from her and the children. She wondered what was going on, but when she asked, he dismissed it with excuses about being busy at work. But Anne-Marie wasn't naive. She knew her husband well enough to sense that something was wrong. It was that intangible change, that subtle distance that made her increasingly uneasy. She tried to confront him, tried to get him to open up, but each time she met a wall of denial. Meanwhile, Thomas's relationship with Laura grew more intimate. They spent more and more time together, sharing secrets and desires that he had never dared to express before. Laura was everything he had been missing in his life. Adventurous, spontaneous, and full of passion. She brought out the best in him, and every time he was with her, he felt more alive than he had in years. One evening, after a dinner that lasted longer than planned, they ended up at Laura's place. Thomas knew from the moment he stepped through her door that he had reached a point of no return. The attraction between them was too strong to ignore any longer. They looked at each other, a moment of unspoken understanding before they fell into each other's arms. That night marked the beginning of an affair that would turn his entire life upside down. As he closed the door of Laura's apartment behind him, he felt a mix of euphoria and guilt. It was as if he had finally found the freedom he had longed for. But at the same time, he knew that this freedom came with a price he had yet to fully comprehend. Back home, everything felt different. Anne-Marie had waited up for him, worried about how late he had returned. But instead of offering the usual excuses, he decided to remain silent that night. He couldn't look her in the eye without feeling guilty, without realizing that he had crossed the line he had once been so sure he would never pass. The following days became increasingly difficult for Thomas. He began to miss Laura intensely when he wasn't with her, but at the same time, he felt a growing distance between him and Anne-Marie. His feelings for Laura were like a storm, destroying everything in its path, and the more he gave into it, the further he drifted from the life he knew. Anne-Marie became more suspicious. She sensed the coldness in their relationship, the unspoken words that hung between them like a dark cloud. She still tried to talk to him, tried to reach him, but each time he deflected her attempts with cool detachment. One day, she decided to confront him directly. She had endured the silence and uncertainty long enough. She asked him straight out what was going on, why he was so distant, why he spent so much time away from home. Thomas had the words on the tip of his tongue, ready to reassure her with a lie, as he had done so many times before. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, with that mix of sadness and determination, or maybe it was the growing guilt that gnawed at him. Instead of answering, he remained silent, unable to tell the truth, but also unable to lie. Anne-Marie felt her heart sink. She knew that his silence was the answer she had feared all along. Tears filled her eyes as she got up from the couch and left the room without saying a word, her world shattered. Thomas was left alone, with only his thoughts for company. He knew he stood at a crossroads. On one side was his life with Anne-Marie, his family, everything he had built. On the other was Laura, the new life he could have, a life full of passion and excitement. But whichever he chose, there would be no easy way back. The only thing he knew was that the life he had known was changed forever. The days following the confrontation were a nightmare for Thomas. Anne-Marie had distanced herself, erecting a wall between them that he couldn't break through. The house felt cold and distant, like a place where he no longer belonged. Each time he tried to talk to her, she turned away, her face a mask of sadness and disappointment. The children felt the tension too. Sophie and Don, usually so cheerful and full of energy, became quiet and withdrawn. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they sensed the change in their parents' behavior. The family that had once been so close was slowly starting to fall apart. Despite the misery at home, Thomas found solace in his time with Laura. She was his refuge, his escape from reality. When he was with her, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. She brought back the excitement he had been missing for so long. But even in those moments of happiness, something began to gnaw at him. The guilt he had once been able to suppress was growing louder. He found his thoughts often drifting to Anne-Marie and the life they had built together. The moments he spent with Laura were thrilling, but they were also tainted by the realization of what he was sacrificing. Laura began to notice the change in him. The man who had once been so full of passion and enthusiasm seemed increasingly distracted, his thoughts somewhere else. She tried to draw him out, to remind him of the connection they shared, but the more she tried, the more he seemed to pull away. One evening, after another strained dinner at home, Thomas sat alone in his study. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He stared at the family photos on his desk, the smiling faces of Sophie and Don, the picture of him and Anne-Marie on their wedding day. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. He had been so consumed by his desire for something new, something exciting, that he had overlooked the damage he was causing to the people he loved most. He thought back to how it all started, how innocent it had seemed at first, just a conversation, just a lunch. But what had begun as a small spark had grown into a fire that now threatened to consume everything in his life. He knew he was at a breaking point, but he still didn't know what to do. Thomas decided he needed to see Laura. He needed to talk to her, to try and make sense of the confusion swirling in his mind. The next day, he left work early and went to her apartment. She welcomed him in with a warm smile, but she could tell something was wrong. They sat down on the couch, the tension between them thick in the air. Thomas struggled to find the right words. He had never imagined he would find himself in this situation, caught between two lives, two loves. "Laura," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I can't keep doing this. I'm tearing my family apart. I thought I could handle it, that I could balance everything, but I can't. I'm losing everything that matters to me." Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with both pain and understanding. She had known from the beginning that this day might come, but it didn't make it any easier. "I understand, Thomas," she said softly. "I never wanted to come between you and your family. I never wanted to cause you this kind of pain." They sat in silence for a long time, the reality of the situation settling in. The passion, the excitement. It all seemed so far away now. All that was left was the cold, hard truth. Thomas had to make a choice, and he knew that no matter what he decided, someone would get hurt. Finally, he stood up, his decision made. "I'm sorry, Laura," he said, his voice trembling. "I have to try to fix things at home. I have to try to make it right." Laura nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'll miss you, Thomas, but I understand." He leaned down and kissed her gently on the forehead, a farewell to the life they had shared. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of her apartment, closing the door on that chapter of his life. Returning home that night, Thomas felt like a man walking to his own execution. The weight of his decision bore down on him, but there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking control of his life again. When he walked through the door, Anne-Marie was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her cup of tea. The house was quiet, the children already in bed. She looked up when she heard him enter, her eyes searching his face for some clue of what he had decided. Thomas walked over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was it, the moment that would define the rest of their lives. He sat down across from her, his hands trembling slightly. "Anne-Marie," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so lost, and I've hurt you more than I can ever say. I've made terrible mistakes, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to make things right. I want to come home." Anne-Marie looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence between them stretching on. Thomas could feel his heart sinking, fearing that he had already lost her. But then, to his surprise, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Thomas, I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, but if you're really willing to try, then I'm willing to try too. Tears filled Thomas's eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. He reached out and took her hand, holding it tightly as if afraid she might slip away. I am, he said earnestly. I want to fix this. I want us to be a family again. They sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that, with time and care, might just reignite the love they had once shared. Over the weeks and months that followed, Thomas worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust he had shattered. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when it seemed like their marriage might not survive. But slowly, step by step, they began to heal. Thomas cut all ties with Laura, focusing entirely on his family. He and Anne-Marie started going to therapy, working through the issues that had driven them apart. They spent more time together as a family, reconnecting with their children and trying to create new memories to replace the painful ones. It was a long and difficult journey, but as the months passed, they began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Their marriage was not the same as it had been before. Some wounds would never fully heal, but they had found a new way forward, a way that acknowledged the past while still allowing for the possibility of a future together. One evening, almost a year after that fateful day, Thomas and Anne-Marie sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The kids were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air. Thomas reached over and took Anne-Marie's hand, squeezing it gently. "We made it," he said softly. Anne-Marie smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yes, we did." As they sat there together, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon, Thomas felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't a perfect ending, life rarely offered those, but it was a new beginning, and that, he realized, was enough.